Hey folks, welcome back. I am your host, Mike Hatch, and man, today we've got an incredible opportunity to hear a very multifaceted, multidimensional perspective on the region of Pittsburgh. And I'm really pumped about this. I've got three amazing guests and incredible friends that I will introduce here in just a moment. But let me preface this by saying that one of the things I love about economics is that it is very multidisciplinary. It tends to touch all sorts of different disciplines. And you're going to get to see that at play here today as we look at geology and history and culture all woven together, because these things all play a significant role in the economics of anywhere and inform us as Christians in terms of our role that we play from a redemptive standpoint. And so today we're going to get the opportunity to learn more about the history from all those different dimensions of Pittsburgh, and then look at how that's formed us and made us who we are today as a culture here in the Pittsburgh region. And that is going to, of course, inform us about how we position ourselves economically from an entrepreneurial standpoint and otherwise to have a redemptive impact here. So let me go ahead and introduce my three guests, and I'm going to do my best to do it extemporaneously. I think that's how you say it. I'm not reading official bios, but I'll have official bios in the show notes. But we'll start, first of all, Steve Austin is with us, and Steve Austin is at least nationally, if not a world famous geologist, co-founder of the Creation Museum. He has been on films, feature films that have been released in theaters, like Is Genesis History, who Del Tackett was the host of that. And Steve Austin is an expert. He, of course, and I'm showing my cards here because I fall into this category as well. Steve comes from a young Earth creation standpoint. For those of you who understand what that means, and that's important to you, that hopefully will give you some perspective on his perspective. He is an expert on the Grand Canyon and is also an expert on Mount St. Helens, in which he did his Ph.D. paper at Penn State, and also will travel to Israel often to dig in the Dead Sea and investigate the layers of mud. And it tells a lot about the history of Israel, and he's actually identified more specific dates of certain earthquakes, for example, that are mentioned in the Bible. And so, Steve Austin, I don't know did I miss anything there as I introduce you?
No, you did a great
All right,
job.
good.
Yeah, I would say a very plus job.
Excellent.
You got the essence of what I'm
Okay,
doing.
excellent. But and Steve is he's also I've never been around anybody who's more excited about geology, and it's fun to be around him. But he's also a nature lover, a beekeeper on his 11 acres as well. So all sorts of fun interests there. So then we also have Bob Jameson with us, and Bob Jameson worked for, or was the president of the name, it's
Family Guidance
Family
Incorporated.
Guidance. Thank you, Bob. Family Guidance for 20 some years, I believe, was the president there until
24
God,
years. Yes.
23 years. Okay.
24. Yep.
24.
Yep.
Until God called you out of that to start Adam's Quest Men's Ministry, in which case he's had a tremendous influence in the Pittsburgh region. I'd say on thousands of men here in Pittsburgh. He helped to organize the sometimes annually or biannually men's event, business event downtown called The Gathering, where hundreds of men would come together and hear the gospel and be impacted by other businessmen who would come in and share their testimonies. And that was, I attended several of those actually, and was able to bring men who were in my men's ministry from Orchard Hill Church at the time, and really, really impactful. And so Bob is also a bit of a historian, at least, I mean, I guess not professionally, but Bob, you and I have had enough interactions and conversations together because we both love history. I'm still learning though. You're way ahead of me, but you're also the co-author of the book Still Faithful, which looks at the history of Pittsburgh from a Christian perspective and all the different men and women who played a significant role. from a faith perspective in Pittsburgh. And so Bob, and now Bob, you let me think here. Is it Mount Lebanon Presbyterian Church?
Yes, Mount Lebanon Evangelical Presbyterian Church. Yes.
Yes. Okay, that is where you are. You attend currently. You've been very involved in CLC, Christ-led communities, a men's discipleship ministry here in Pittsburgh. Led many groups, have been on boards and leadership teams here in the Pittsburgh region, and have a real heart for discipleship. So did I miss anything, Bob? Does that cover most of it?
He sounds like a good fellow. I'd like to meet him someday.
Yes. Okay. Excellent. And then Mike Arnold. Mike Arnold is with us, who is currently you are the executive pastor. Is that right? At Christ Church of Grove Farm. Is that correct?
Senior associate pastor.
Oh, senior associate. Okay, senior associate pastor at Christ Church of Grove Farm. You've been a pastor for many years. Before that, at another church in Cranberry. And Mike and I actually met at a gym that we attended together, worked out together a few times, sweated a little bit together. And our chiropractor is a good buddy of ours. But not only that, but Mike has also been very involved in the business world. He is let me see if I get this title right, the executive director of CBMC. Is that right?
Yep. Area director, Pittsburgh area director.
Okay.
So you're right there. Yeah.
Pittsburgh area director of CBMC, which is which stands for the
It's a tricky one. Christian Businessmen's Connection.
Yes, I'm sorry. For some reason, the Christian part I left me. I don't know why. So Christian Businessmen's Connection. And you are one of the few pastors in Pittsburgh, not putting anybody down, because we're all on our own journey, but you're one of the few pastors in Pittsburgh that gets it, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to business and entrepreneurship and the redemptive impact that it has in the community. I can literally count on 3 fingers, I think, the number of pastors that I would say have that mentality and understand that. And so I'm grateful for your perspective, Mike. And you were actually trained also as through the Methodist Church, I believe is what you said, around the culture of Pittsburgh, which is why I brought you to come and share your perspective, because we've had conversations about that, and it's been incredibly enlightening to understand more about that. And you've also done events around CBMC events, prayer breakfast events around Pittsburgh, where hundreds of men have attended, and I dare say you've impacted thousands of men here in the region over the years as well. So anything I missed there, Mike?
No, that's very good. I like to meet that guy as well, just like Bob said. It's great.
Fantastic. All right. Well, welcome, all 3 of you. I am so grateful to have you guys with us today. And so, Steve, we're going to start with you, our geology expert. And what I want to start with, the uniqueness of Pittsburgh from a geological perspective. And that'll, of course, bleed into the history of Pittsburgh as well. But, Steve, you are an adjunct professor at Cedarville University. That was one thing I missed. I did not include that. And you will take students on tours of Pittsburgh because you love the geological exposure, if you will, that is in Pittsburgh. And I got the opportunity to go on one of those tours, and it was amazing. I recommend it to anybody. What people should do is organize a tour with you. It isn't just Cedarville students, maybe just Pittsburgh students, or just anybody from Pittsburgh. So, Steve, tell us a little bit about the unique geological characteristics of Pittsburgh.
Well, let me tell you about me first, and then I'll tell you about my interaction with Pittsburgh. When I was an undergraduate student, I became very interested in coal, understanding the geologic conditions that make coal, and understanding the coal controversy as to how coal formed. And I'm living in a place called Silicon Valley, California. I'm native Californian, and I say to myself, hey, what would be the best place to understand this subject and go to school on the origin of coal? Well, I said, Penn State University is a world-class university, and so they ought to know about coal. And that's where the Silicon Valley guy discovered Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania. And I knew about the coal bed very early. It is something marvelous in the world, basically, and it's right here in Pittsburgh. But I'm passing through. I'm passing through from Silicon Valley to Penn State University. The big city is the avenue to central Pennsylvania, where I'm going to school. But I always stop by and take a look. And when I started looking at the origin of coal and coal-bearing strata at Penn State, it was Western Pennsylvania, the Pittsburgh coal bed, and understanding other coal beds in Kentucky. And so it became very close to my attention what was going on in Pittsburgh. So that started my interest in Pennsylvania, always passing through Pittsburgh to get to Penn State University from Silicon Valley, California. So how about that? Okay, you have a Silicon Valley kid who is recommending Pittsburgh and fanatically interested in the geology of Pittsburgh, and that whole thing, came my way. And so I got to know the geology of Pittsburgh. It started with just personal friends, and then it became school buses, basically. So I'd get together with somebody's car. Oh, hey, let's go look at some the favorite outcrops of Pittsburgh, and let's drive around and just go see them. And then what happened was I graduated from taking mom and dad and close friends out to see Pittsburgh, and then it became school buses. And so we would get 50 people in a school bus, and we would go out and we would see the geologic outcrops and high walls in parking lots, especially, and Kmart and Home Depot and Sam's Club and Costco and all of that kind of stuff. And so everybody's got their favorite outcrops, and so they want me to come interpret them. And so we put everybody in the school bus and we go. Well, there was a field trip that I led just in October. The Geological Society of America was having a meeting here in Pittsburgh. The Geological Society of America is a very famous geology organization. And Cedarville University asked me to lead the field trip, and other people could go. And so, that happens. And so it's a school bus. And so, we got to have a school bus because we can't park all the vehicles in one area. It's tight fit, and so we did school bus. Well, in October of last year was the Geological Society of America field trip, and unfortunately, it was a cloudy day. And when you have a school bus full of people, where do you take them initially? Well, you take them to Mount Washington, where you see three rivers from, the south side of the Monongahela River, looking out to the north, and you see, of course, the history of the city displayed. Unfortunately, it was a cloudy day, and you couldn't see anything from the Washington.
Yeah.
And so geology field trips are supposed to be about what you see, okay? And when you can't see it, you've got to improvise, right? So So I'm out there at Mount Washington talking about what we can't see, and so it's kind of a dud. So I waxed eloquent about the history of Pittsburgh, and everybody knows the view from Pittsburgh from Mount Washington.
Yeah,
So
and you talked about, you mentioned all the different places we go. Like I love the one of the places that I loved was going behind the Best Buy on McKnight Road, and
unbelievable
yeah,
outcrop.
and apparently
Yeah.
there's a plethora of shark teeth and shark fossils that you can find back there that come off there. So just random places you would never know. But okay, so share, if you would, can you just share what you shared on Mount Washington that day? Because I think that was the day I was with you, and
Yeah.
it was very it's just very helpful to understand the uniqueness of Pittsburgh. I mean, you've already kind of mentioned it. The coal bed is a wonder, here in Pittsburgh. Talk about the different pieces that of the puzzle that came together, if you will, and the fact that someone as early as George Washington noticed the value of it.
I would go back to 1750. Okay, there's the French and Indian Wars, and they have that Fort Duquesne. Okay, and it later becomes Fort Pitt when the Americans take over. Okay, and but it kind of just stands for the the uniqueness of Pittsburgh. Look at, three rivers come together. The Allegheny and the Monongahela River join to form the Ohio River, and the Ohio River is that gateway to the west, okay, going down into the mid-continent area. It's geologically and historically incredible that a river in, the Allegheny River that forms in southern New York flows not to Lake Erie and the Atlantic Ocean. It flows down this kind of unusual terrain, really unusual terrain to the south, and then of course it joins Monongahela and becomes the Ohio River, and that goes off to the west. From George Washington's point of view, standing on Mount Washington, he realizes that this is prime real estate, okay? This is got to be one of the most unusual locations in the United States that he knows of. And he's a surveyor, and he recognizes the economic and historical importance. And so they got a fort there, okay, because the rivers join, and they use wood to burn to make the heating conditions for the settlement that's there. But wood becomes kind of scarce, okay, because this place is really unique, and lots of people come and they need to have a fort. But they discover something on the slopes of Mount Washington as you look down to Fort Pitt and the settlement there, that this has this coal bed, and they discover the coal bed right 2/3 of the way up Mount Washington on the slopes of the Monongahela River. They discover the coal bed, and it's about 8 feet thick. Okay, and so there's not a scarcity of coal. Okay, and so of course they're doing things at Fort Pitt, like they're milling sandstone, making millstones they can send down the river to other villages like Cincinnati.
Yeah.
So all this commerce going west, settlement going west, they discover the coal bed, and they discover that they have the resource for building a whole empire, essentially. And
And real quick, hey
uh,
Steve, I
the
want to interrupt you for a second because there's one key thing that I wanted you to also mention, if you don't mind, especially with regards to the river coming down from New York and joining the Monongahela. You talked about how the tilt of the land here in western PA, like you said, would have normally caused the river to move toward Lake Erie. However,
Yeah.
I think what was it that stopped that from happening and caused it to detour the way that it did down toward Pittsburgh?
Yeah, so it's the ice age. The ultimate answer is glacier ice blocked Erie Basin
Yeah.
and prevented the drainage from going north, which is where it should go, and it turned to the south and to the west.
That's amazing.
And so everything is cockeyed, and basically it was a lake. A lake stood over Pittsburgh and was a big lake, something like Erie size, an Erie sized lake sat over Pittsburgh, and then the lake drained the way it could, the easiest way, and it drained south and it drained west.
And real quick,
right
I just
in-
want to point this out real quick. I think this is amazing. So during the Ice Age, God had
Yeah.
in mind how to carve the earth out in such a way that led to this place called Pittsburgh, where all these things were to come together. My mind is blown by that. And of course, from a young earth perspective, if that's your perspective, you could even go back and say the flood, which then caused the Ice Age, which then caused what do you call it? The big piece of ice. The glacier. Thank you, Bob. Yeah. Like that all culminated. That blows my mind that all these things came together and it was God, like he made it happen. Anyway, so I just wanted to make that.
So geology made this completely unique place called Pittsburgh,
Yeah.
right? People discovered that, and then in the discovery of this thing, you have an abundant energy resource, coal bed, and that made the brick industry go. Okay, what do you need to have a big city? You need to have bricks, right? You later need to have steel, and the steel technology came as a result of the coal bed here. The iron ore was imported from Michigan. Okay, they made coke in Pittsburgh, and then they smelted the iron ore and made steel. Of course, they made glass with the coal bed. Okay, the glass sand is right here. And so everything is ready for this this amazing thing to happen. Okay, right in Pittsburgh of all places. And the cockeyed drainage because of the Ice Age makes the unusual terrain, and then that allows the coal bed to be exposed right where it needs to be, next to the three rivers, and so that makes the city possible. God had Pittsburgh in mind from the beginning, I think.
Absolutely.
And here we are sitting with 17,000 feet of strata below us. Okay, in Pittsburgh, we got 17,000 feet of strata, so we've got all of the recipe ready to go for the oil industry, right? Okay,
Yes,
and
right.
you don't understand. You got to understand Pittsburgh as being certainly relevant to the oil industry.
Yep, big time.
And a guy named Colonel Drake was aware that the gravel thickness varied going northward, and he understood that the river drainage was originally to Lake Erie. Now that the Ice Age blocked the drainage, created the lake. The lake overtopped. It spilled and drained the lake to make the unusual terrain that is obviously Pittsburgh. And then, then we come along later and we marvel at, what is there. Okay, so George Washington met the Indian chief, right? And they discovered the powerful thinking of this place, and then all the resources became available to make Pittsburgh this marvelous city, and it still is. And here I am, a Silicon Valley kid, telling you. Telling you I moved to Pittsburgh and discovered this thing.
That's amazing.
Okay, so I lead school buses with people talking about, I talk mainly about the geology, and we go to the parking lots and look for fossils and strata.
All right. Well, thank you, Steve. That was so good. I really appreciate it. I think hopefully that gives, again, our listeners the perspective just how unique Pittsburgh was, and then knowing what we did in terms of basically building the infrastructure of the United States, really, through the steel industry. Yeah. Plus you have oil and the coal, and man, it's all starting here, and then the Ohio River leading west, carrying all this stuff west. I mean, it's unbelievable how it all played out. So then, Bob, I want to bring you in here a little bit to talk a little bit about the history of Pittsburgh. Well, we've been talking about the history of Pittsburgh, of course, already, but we have these characters that show up in Pittsburgh, right?
They're characters, yes. They were characters.
Right.
Our share of characters.
Redemptive Economics is completely listener-supported and dependent on the contributions of listeners. If you resonate with the message of Redemptive Economics and want to support the cause, there are 3 ways you can partner with us. The first is you can subscribe to the podcast for $5 a month and unlock all the amazing interviews and content without the interruption of advertisements. Secondly, you can donate to Redemptive Economics, either making a one-time gift or supporting monthly to help us offset the production costs and reach more people for the sake of the gospel. Lastly, if you're a business, you can choose to advertise with us. Right now, we're offering a limited number of spots for sponsorships for the first year at $150 per month or $1,800 for the year. I would be so grateful for your partnership. Check out the show notes for all the links that will lead to more information about how to support our mission to empower Christian entrepreneurs. People like Carnegie, right? And Frick. And I'm not a big fan of Frick. And even Carnegie, honestly, the more I learn about him, the more I dislike him in certain ways. But anyway, these guys came in and they did play a huge role in the industry that was developed here.
They were the Elon Musk of their generation. You can respect them, but there's some things that that you might not like about them, but they accomplished some really significant things.
But I appreciate you saying that. Actually, that's really good perspective. So Bob, I'm curious, what would be some things that you might highlight as we think of the history here and the people involved that recognized all these natural resources that Steve just described and put them together in a constructive way?
A couple of things. Thank you, Steve, for a great rock solid foundation here for us to move forward.
That's right.
I'm glad you mentioned the oil industry. That's often forgotten that Pittsburgh was the epicenter of the worldwide oil industry at the very beginning.
Yeah, Colonel Drake drilled that well.
Absolutely.
He drilled that well in up Titusville area. It made the oil industry almost immediately successful.
My grandfather lived in Bradford, not too far from Oil City, and drove truck for the oil industry. That was his job. Of course, then obviously steel and coal were huge industries. And I'm glad too, Steve, you mentioned George Washington, who I think of as really the first Pittsburgher. The guy, he was the second son. He was not the oldest son in the Washington family, and therefore he was not supposed to inherit Mount Vernon. He had to go find a trade, go find work somewhere. And he was an outdoorsman. He was a famed horseman, and so he decided I'll be a land surveyor. Now, where's there a lot of in colonial America? Where's there a lot of unsurveyed land? Well, it's west, So he surveyed land all over Western Virginia, now West Virginia, and of course Virginia at that time claimed Western Pennsylvania. There were conflicting land claims, and so he became very familiar with the Pittsburgh area. In fact, later on, when his older brother conveniently passed away, and George did inherit Mount Vernon, he knew all of the choice land plots and bought the best pieces. He probably made more money in real estate than he ever made from Mount Vernon. He was very interested. He quickly grasped the strategic importance of the Pittsburgh area and bought lots of land here. As a matter of fact, I have a friend who was the new pastor of a church in Hickory, Pennsylvania. The committee there told him, "We brought you here. We have great hopes for your pastorate here at our church. We just want to give you one word of advice: don't ever say anything good about George Washington."
Oh, wow.
What? And turns out the previous pastor on the 4th of July made the mistake of praising George Washington, and about 5 families got up and walked out. Apparently,
Wow.
the early settlers were squatters on some land that Washington had bought. They didn't know. I mean, they didn't have deeds, properties. You find a good meadow someplace, and you chop down some trees, and you build a little cabin. And they had squatted on his land. And every year he would go by and, excuse me, you're going to have to leave here because this is actually my property. But I wish you well. And so I said,
Wow.
probably your first sermon when you start there is like a sermon on forgiveness. Like, it's been 240 years. Maybe we ought to forgive that. We can let that go now.
Yeah.
But Washington understood how important water transportation was. If we're going to be a great nation, we have to be able to transport goods, merchandise, people. And that water, we now, with modern transportation, waterways are still extremely important. To some extent, geology is destiny. But in the early days, it's hard to overestimate how important water transportation was. During the time of the Whiskey Rebellion, the first challenge to the federal law enforcement in the new nation, Western Pennsylvania and much of the frontier disagreed with the passing of an unfair tax. And part of the reason was, economically, the only way that Western Pennsylvania, basically people here literally didn't have money even to pay the tax. This was a barter economy. They had no coins, no gold, no silver. And the only way they could get money, and this was subsistence farming here. There was no need for money. You could get by in the frontier without money. But if you wanted to get money, you had to trade with the East Coast. You had to get to Philadelphia somehow. And there was this mountain range, and there were no roads. How do we even do that? It was easier. The only product that they could make, that they could transport to Philadelphia. I mean, you can't take corn there; it would rot in the back of your wagon before you got there. What can we get there? Well, you can make and distill whiskey, and that would keep, and you could sell it in Philadelphia, where the population center was. And so that's exactly what the federal government decided to tax. So, wow.
Yeah, it wasn't. So the whiskey served almost as a currency, didn't it, for a while?
Exactly. Yeah. It was, in those days, water transportation was so important because there were no roads, no railroads, no planes, of course. It was literally faster and cheaper to transport your products down the Ohio River, down the Mississippi River, through the Gulf of Mexico, up the East Coast, and up the Delaware River. You would get to Philadelphia faster than if you tried to ride a horse to Philadelphia. It was faster and cheaper. George Washington understood how important water transportation was going to be for an expanding nation. We didn't know that there was even a Rocky Mountain range. We knew somewhere the land just went on and on until it met an ocean somewhere. That's all we knew. That's why President Jefferson sent the Lewis and Clark expedition, which started in the boats were built in Elizabeth, Pennsylvania, by the way.
They started from the point, I believe, right?
Yeah, the boats were built in Elizabeth. They were floated down to the point, and yes, this was the starting point for Lewis and Clark. All they knew was that we had to have waterways, inland waterways, to get where we wanted to go. And so he got some entrepreneurs together, and they formed a canal company. Their vision was to build a canal that would connect the Potomac River to the Ohio River somehow, whether Pittsburgh or we don't know exactly. They never actually got the Washington died in 1799. The canal system eventually was completed, but it was the Pennsylvania Canal that connected with Pittsburgh. But they knew that to be able to the economic vitality of the nation depended on using waterways effectively. So that made Pittsburgh extremely important. So I'm glad that we mentioned, we started with talking about Washington. Carnegie is an interesting character too. Carnegie was, of course, born in Scotland, and like many Scots of that era, it was a difficult time economically for Scotland. His family moved to the Pittsburgh area. Actually, grew up in Allegheny City, which is what they called the North Side in that day. It was later on incorporated into the city of Pittsburgh, and he was a bright young lad, and he got a job as a personal assistant to the guy that ran the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was a really good place for a young man to pick up business tips and management tips. And he decided, he had an entrepreneurial bent to him, and he heard about this new technology of the Bessemer converter that had been invented in England, and said, I want to do that here. I think that's the future. And Pittsburgh.
And explain real quick what the Bessemer converter. Explain what that is, because I've heard of that, but I want to make sure folks know.
Basically, it can take iron and convert it into steel, which is much stronger. You can do things with steel that you can't do by hammering iron out. For example, we take this for granted, but in the days when railroads were starting, railroads were pretty useless if you didn't have bridges. If you could only take it as far until you ran into water, well, that's as far as. Then there's no usefulness to railroads. Carnegie realized with this new product we could build bridges, and railroads could go unfettered. And he decided, but people were scared. There were only wooden bridges. Think about it. Like, how can you build a wooden bridge across the Ohio River? Well, you couldn't. You needed ferries. The Vanderbilts made their first millions of dollars running ferries, and later on, but Carnegie realized we could build bridges with this new product. So he built a bridge across the Mississippi River, but everybody was scared to death because they had never seen nobody would go across it, because nobody had seen a bridge that could hold up and over this long distance. Over a creek, that's okay, but across the Mississippi River. So he actually had a big event, where he rented elephants. Okay, and I don't know where you go to rent elephants, but somewhere he rented elephants, and he had a parade across the Mississippi River, and everybody said, "Holy cow! I've never seen a bridge." People weren't scared anymore of riding across steel bridges. They're all, and nobody could easily build a building taller than 3 stories without a steel superstructure. All of a sudden, you could make skyscrapers. Steel was the future. Carnegie began to manufacture it. He understood the importance of lowering the price. If you lower the price, you increase the economic model of even at a lower price, your volume goes up dramatically. And so he understood if we get the latest, newest thing in manufacturing, we can just roll out huge volume and keep the cost affordable, and we'll sell tons and tons and tons of steel. One time he was dedicating a new factory, a new plant, steel mill. And as they were cutting the ribbon, somebody said to him, "It's a shame, we put all this money into this, and now they came up with this new converter that would enable us to produce steel even cheaper." And Carnegie said, "What?" He never used that steel mill. He scrapped it on the day that they were doing the ribbon cutting ceremony, and bought the newest technology because it could produce more cheaper and faster.
Interesting.
So he was an early adopter of whatever the newest technology was. So Carnegie was a huge factor there. That
sounds similar.
Yeah,
that sounds similar to John D. Rockefeller and what he did with oil and standardizing oil. Literally, it was called Standard Oil, where he would refine it to make it so that it was less combustible or something, as opposed to kerosene.
For use in your home. Exactly.
Yeah. Right. I'm sorry. He would actually. Yeah. He helped create kerosene so you could use it in your homes versus something that would be more combustible. Standardizing that product so that he could, in a similar way, change the economics of it and make more money doing it.
Yeah, they refined oil and got the kerosene out of it, and they and they had this leftover byproduct called gasoline that was useless, and they just poured it into the river, literally, and it
No way.
flowed down, the Cuyahoga River into Cleveland.
Yeah.
Wow.
Sorry for the dig there, Mike. I had to.
No, that's
Yeah.
great. That is amazing. And so you've got this entrepreneurial spirit here,
Yes.
that
Yes.
where you
Pittsburgh
had
was
these.
the Silicon Valley of
Yeah,
120 years ago.
absolutely. With the raw materials that were here, that kind of were set up
Glass,
geologically.
steel, aluminum, the world's largest aluminum company, Alcoa. It all happened here.
Man, and people get, part of the reason why that people like Carnegie and others maybe get a bad name is because of the way they treated the workers, or
Yeah.
took advantage of them in some ways. And so I'm curious, Bob, on your perspective on this, and then eventually we'll get to Mike as well, because this is going to play into our culture today too. Unions started
Yep.
as a result of that disparity, right, between like management and the workers who felt like they were really taken advantage of. Yet at the same time, these workers all did volunteer in a sense to work there. And I'm not trying to justify the ways that that things were dangerous,
You
but
can look at this two ways.
yeah.
Absolutely.
I was going to ask you what your
In fact, in
perspective
my
was on it.
family, Mike, my dad went to law school and was hired by Bethlehem Steel in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, to examine union grievances. This worker is paid a certain scale for doing X, Y, and Z, but he's also doing A, B, and C, and therefore should be paid more. My dad would have to look at the legal contract and determine, is this, are we being fair or not? So my dad was kind of at the epicenter of that. He also hated his job because no matter what his decision was, either the union would think you're giving away too much of our money, and labor would think, oh, you're a management stooge. You're just you're not giving us what we think we earn. It's a no-win situation. So, in fairness to the entrepreneurs, they were on terra incognita. They were inventing big business, and there was no precedent for this. No common cultural understanding of what's fair and what's not fair. They had huge scale operations, and they hired masses of people, and they were paying enough that, hey, it pays more than working on the family farm, and so they had no hard time finding people, and people were expendable. It was also very hard, dangerous work. People don't realize this, but in the early 1900s, your life expectancy or work expectancy, if you were hired to work in a Pittsburgh steel mill, was 10 years. Within 10 years, you can expect to either be dead or disabled. It was hard physical labor and very dangerous. How much is it worth for you, to make you feel like I want to work in that place? Also, if you lost your job, you were living in a company town. You were living in a house that was owned by U.S. Steel or Bethlehem Steel or Carnegie Steel, and you not only lost your job, you instantly lost your source of income and were instantly homeless. It was you can look at this both ways, and both of them I have a lot of sympathy for. They both have good points, and both of them kind of cross some lines that, in retrospect, it's easier for us to look and say, oh, well, they were really abusive or that. But they were inventing the new workplace, and they got some things wrong, but they got a lot of things right too.
Yep. And there was if I remember correctly, I'm double checking this online. I'm actually looking up right now. In around 1892.
Homestead strike.
Yes, exactly. The Homestead strike. Was that kind of the first, I mean, to your knowledge, was that the first real big revolt with regards to? That
was one of the first. It was the first big one. They had to call in the state militia. It was too big for the local constabulary. They basically, the workers on the company property kept the company from using its property, and so they kind of took over. They took over the steel mill, and the only way to have access to their own steel mill, the company hired Pinkerton, basically a private militia, and sent them up in barges on the Monongahela River, and there was gunfire. There was an exchange, and there were people killed. That was a rallying cry for the union movement across the nation. Looking at it again, I have sympathy for both sides. It was a tough situation.
And that was, if I remember correctly, too, I remember seeing this in I think a documentary about Pittsburgh. There was an interesting thing that happened with regards to Carnegie and Frick, because they were together on this, and Carnegie, he left town apparently.
Yeah, he was vacationing in Scotland.
Yeah,
Yes.
During all this time, and Frick had to kind of
he had to do the dirty work.
Yeah, and he was apparently good at the dirty work, which is part of the distaste that I have for him.
Let me tell you how tough he was.
Yeah.
Trying to seize on this unrest, there was a revolutionary from Russia who got the idea that he was going to create a new revolution, a workers' revolution, and he decided he was going to assassinate Frick. He cased Frick's office for weeks and discovered the guy's a workaholic. He never leaves his office, okay? And so, but everybody else, including his security detail, leaves for lunch. So that I'm going to go into his office and I'm going to shoot the dog dead while he's having lunch. So he does. He breaks into the office, and Frick gets up from his desk. What do you want here? And the guy pulls out a revolver and fires a shot in Frick's chest. Carrying the bullet in his chest, Frick walks around his desk, wrestles the guy to the ground. Meanwhile, there's a police officer on the street who heard the gunshot, runs up, and they disarm the anarchist.
Wow.
And Frick, by this time, owns the only telephone line in Pittsburgh, a private line from his office to his home. Calls his wife and says, "You might hear some disturbing news. Don't worry, I'm fine. I'll be home for dinner." And he finishes his work day at the office and goes home for dinner. A doctor arrives and pulls the bullet out, extracts the bullet, and Frick finishes his work day. Now, they don't make guys like that anymore.
Oh my!
Wow.
He was one tough hombre. Yeah.
That's crazy.
That's how incendiary the social, political, economic situation was between workers and management at that time.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, so and that, to some extent continued. Unions gained strength in the early 20th century.
Yes.
And then let's kind of fast forward a little bit as we get to the 70s and 80s, where the steel industry ended up leaving. Now, personally, from an economic standpoint, I believe that the 1971 Nixon takes us off the gold standard. The dollar is
very
printed
strong,
like crazy.
Yep.
And so we begin
to imports cheaper.
Exactly. And they export the production of this stuff as a result. So that's kind of that's part of the story I think a lot of people don't know. They just know that, hey, these greedy, business people decided to export the production of steel, but there were some underlying layers or undercurrents that were happening that contributed to that. But so anyway, yeah, so we get into the 70s and 80s, and I actually grew up in the 80s here in Pittsburgh, in the South Hills. And interestingly enough, I do not remember. I watched this incredible documentary about it. Man, it was a tumultuous time. Holy cow. I can't believe I wasn't aware of what was going on around me. As a kid, sometimes you're just kind of in a bubble. Yeah. But yeah, can you speak a little bit about that, Bob, about kind of the 70s and 80s and how that played out here in Pittsburgh with the steel industry leaving and just the town reeling?
Yeah, well, we still had our steelers, but we didn't have steel anymore. They were shutting down plants right and left for a variety of reasons. One, basically costs were too high because the dollar was very strong and it was cheaper to import the steel. And secondly, labor costs were quite high, and labor was not going to take pay cuts, and understandably so. But if the alternative is you lose your job. What do you do? There was no good alternative there. Steel as an industry was becoming less and less viable, and that created a lot of social tensions. And for our generation that grew up in Pittsburgh, a lot of them, like my brothers, live in Phoenix and Los Angeles. If you can get a job somewhere else, go somewhere else. And we've had now half a century of population decline in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
My daughter now lives in Charlotte, and they've had a half a century of population increase. That's all the new downtown buildings and that sort of thing, but that's not so much in Pittsburgh. So that caused we're in search of a new economic base. We lost oil, but we had steel. Now we're losing steel, and the hope is with Carnegie Mellon, et cetera, that technology is getting a really good foothold here. But the problem is that the new industries are not going to hire old steel workers. It's still going to be a painful situation for a lot of the people who were tied into the old economy of Pittsburgh. It's a seemingly intractable economic situation here in Pittsburgh that's creating a lot of social tension.
Yeah, and I was amazed as I learned about how tightly the steelworkers held on for the longest time. I mean, there was a time, I'm forgetting what it was a lady's name that they called this steel mill. I forget the name of it now.
The Eliza furnace?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. Where actually the steelworkers, without being paid, they winterized it because it was supposed to be one of the last steel mills to shut down. And they winterized it and went in and made sure that it would continue to work because they wanted to ensure the fact that it would, move on. But of course, the owner of that company still decided to shut it down. But these guys, these steel workers were so, like, the pride involved in their work.
Yeah, my
they
grandfather
loved
worked in
it.
the steel mill. My dad worked in the steel mill. I'm a steel worker. It was not just I'm doing this for a job. This is my identity.
Absolutely, yeah,
That's
exactly.
That's hard to change.
Oh, totally, yeah, definitely, and it's continued on to this day. To the attitude that our culture has now, and maybe this is
growing up in Johnstown. I remember our neighbor across the street worked for one of the steel companies, and he was laid off. And he was kind of like, oh, okay, so I get a nice little vacation. They'll call me back to work, and I'm thinking, like, you don't understand. Like, it's not that kind of thing. Steel is going away. It's not coming back. He was never called back.
Oh my gosh!
But there was that idea. Well, yeah, they've had layoffs before, but they'll hire me back when they need more labor. In the meantime, I can kind of loaf for a while. No, this is a different kind of deal now.
Yeah, and I go into some of the economic implications with regards to the expansion of currency supply and the way that biblically speaking, a dishonest weight and measure when monetary units are produced arbitrarily, and how it's inflationary, it steals value from other people, and then in the process things like this happen. And Pittsburgh is a big giant example of this, but it happens all over the country. You hear of other industries shutting down, unfortunately, as a result. TBD Bookkeeping is who I use for my bookkeeping needs, and I'm thrilled to recommend them to you. As business owners with 3 kids themselves, Ryan and Danielle Hatch understand the value of time and the importance of work-life balance. TBD Bookkeeping can take over the day-to-day bookkeeping of your business so you can focus more on growth, operations, and customer relationships. I can speak from experience. If you're a business owner, you need a bookkeeper, and TBD Bookkeeping is simply the best in the business. Find their contact information in the show notes, and when you mention Redemptive Economics, you'll receive 10% off your first 3 months. Call TBD Bookkeeping today and learn more about the benefits I've experienced: more time, peace of mind, and the ability to plan for the future. So, Bob, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that perspective. And so, Mike, let's transition to you now, and kind of the cultural ramifications now that have happened since all of this. Really interesting now, because as I've talked to you before, there is this really, I I don't know how to say it. I guess resentment, or I don't know the word you would use, but like we talk about this between the management and labor that played out for so
Sure.
long, and how we still have residual effects of that today. Can you give a little bit of insight into
Yeah,
what that looks like?
absolutely. I'd love to give a little bit of background, just my experience as
Yeah.
well, like Steve did. I'm a fourth generation Pittsburgher, which is kind of hard to
Ah,
believe.
yes.
Um, I moved away for a season of my life as my dad opened a chapter of the family business in Northeast Ohio, Akron, Cleveland, as Bob was digging at me earlier with our river catching on fire.
That's
I mean,
right.
even though the Monongahela is not the cleanest waterway in the country, very hard to cast drones. Cuyahoga River might be dirtier. But so moved away from there, lived in Las Vegas, Nevada for a number of years, completely different culture. And both of my dad and my grandfather were entrepreneurs in this area. My other grandfather
Hmm.
worked for P&H Crane. He was an engineer. He made cranes that were in the steel mills.
Hmm.
My wife's father was a laborer. My wife's grandfather was a strip miner. He owned a coal company in
Hmm.
Indiana, PA. So all tied into this
Wow.
industry and the fabric of what's going on. I was called to the ministry in pastoring, and one of the things that you do in ministry is you bridge this timeless truth of the gospel to a culture
Hmm.
in a specific place and time.
Yep.
And growing up in Ohio, the culture was just a little bit different. Some similarities. It was the rubber industry in Akron, Ohio, that left, not the
Hmm.
steel industry. But some things different, and as far as Appalachian culture versus Midwestern culture. Las Vegas, a completely different culture during a time when it is booming and growing. When I lived there, still continues to grow. And then you come back into Pittsburgh, and you have to exegete the culture
Hmm.
of where you're bringing the gospel into.
Yep.
And there's needs and understandings and ways of thought that people have. And so for 18 years, I've lived here, sharing this timeless truth into this culture.
Hmm.
And there's a number of, things that are unique around this the idea of scarcity, where you're seeing loved ones, go away, and people having left. The steel mill job that Bob was talking about either earlier, it was more than a job; it was a way of life. I mean, there was a camaraderie working in the steel mill. You would hit the watering hole at the end of the day before you went home. You would talk
Hmm.
about your day
True.
with your guys.
Hmm.
Often these are the guys you played softball with. Different mills had different social circles, and they'd play sports against each other. And
Hmm.
it was there was a neat way of life
Hmm.
with this work. If you needed some more resources, you would do time and a half and work overtime, and maybe grab a shift on the weekend. There was like ways to do life, and that was blown up, and
Hmm.
there was a stability to that. So scarcity,
Wow.
certainly something that was here. But when I entered in now 18 years back into Pittsburgh, there's a significant pride in this community.
Oh,
If
yeah,
you
absolutely.
if you lived in Pittsburgh, you chose to live in Pittsburgh. As Bob mentioned, there are other ways to make livings in other cities, to go to Charlotte or to Phoenix
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
other cities. The brain drain and exodus out of the Western Pennsylvania area is profound. So people who stayed here chose to.
Hmm.
They love it. They love the land here. They love the geography. They love the natural beauty of this area, and they love the relationships of people that they have here.
Hmm.
So there's a determination that probably goes all the way back to George Washington. This was not the easiest land to settle.
Hmm.
When you go to the Fort Pitt Museum and you look at what they went through to build a civilization here,
Hmm.
there's a lot of places that you can build it. You could do it a lot easier
Hmm.
than Pittsburgh, but there's a determination and there are resources and reasons to do so. So all of that is part of the fabric of the people that are here. The
Wow.
terrain also sets up a really uniqueness in Western Pennsylvania that is different than Ohio, even where there is. It's hard to know the community on the other side of the hill, on
Yeah.
the other side of the river, and it's difficult to get there. Back in even in
Hmm.
my father's day, he lived in the South Hills, and he said that if the work it would take to make a sales call up in Wexford or like the Cranberry area
Yeah.
and get back down, just to get back down to dinner was almost impossible. You had to leave. He would tell me these stories like you left at 2 o'clock, or you left at 1 o'clock, or we got a hotel. up in that area just to make sales calls on the other side of
Oh
town
my gosh.
because the
Wow.
traffic and roads weren't great. There
Yeah.
wasn't a freeway system even in my father's age, right?
Wow.
And so it created this almost clannish mentality where people were suspicious of those outside of their village. And there's a tight-knit community, still exists in Pittsburgh. So my wife's from Indiana, PA. When she meets someone else from Indiana, PA, they'll go, "Hey, do you know the Smiths, or do you know the Joneses, or do you know?" And what they're doing is that's a trust bridge.
Yeah.
Like, oh, you're part of the clan.
Yeah.
Even if you just know someone within that clan, they're building trust. Often they're going back around and maybe asking that person, "Do you really know this person?" And if you do, then they're great. But those connections they're actually there's something going on there that's more profound than just, "Hey, we have mutual friends." It's are you connected to my clan?
Yeah.
Are you connected to the tribe that I'm a part of? So really interesting. Even as I've moved here 18 years ago now, but growing up in Ohio, my wife is part of the clan. As Bob will mention, I'm on the fringes still. They're still trying to make up their mind whether or not, even though I've buried their moms as their pastor
We
and
love you,
baptized their
Mike.
children.
We love
Oh,
you.
you love me, but still, we don't fully trust you. We don't fully know, until I start really bowing the knee to the Steelers. Then maybe you're in. It would help a lot. I know. But like that's really profound here. When you minister here, the inside versus outsider piece is a big part of the fabric of what's going on here. Some of that might be, from Scottish or Irish or the way the city was set up, the mentality of family and what that means.
Yeah, you think about the names of the people. I think there's actually there's a town I remember. I forget where I was. I think it's east of Pittsburgh. Literally, I think it's called Scotland. There are like Wexford. Like there's some Scotch Irish roots here. Absolutely, for sure. And okay, real question. A quick question though, Mike. Too, just your thought on this. And Bob, I don't know if you might have some wisdom on this too, but the steel mills were kind of all over Western PA. Do you think that was because of the geographic kind of isolation of these different places? And because on one hand, I was thinking as you were sharing, Mike, I'm thinking, wow, the steel industry would have caused some unity among the different clans in some respect, right? But then at the same time, the steel mills, I remember seeing a map of them. They were spread all over. I'm wondering if there was unity, but yet still they were still in their own neck of the woods, where they worked.
But I imagine Beaver County is significantly different than Munhall back in the day. Those are two different steel centers, two different groups of people that identified fiercely with their area. That's what I would imagine.
They would build a mill always on water, for one thing. It would have to be some place there was enough water for it to be navigable and to cool off the ingots. Also, labor supply was an important consideration. Also, there's some advantage to building a mill out close to where there are a lot of farm boys who want to get a job off mom and dad's property, and we can hire them cheap there. That's a factor. The availability of like the coal fields and things like that. Those are all factors. There's no one thing. Why Pittsburgh? Another thing that we probably didn't mention was that the fact that Andrew Carnegie grew up here was a big factor. He was sort of like the same reason why is Detroit known for, why did that become the center of the auto industry? Well, Henry Ford was from Detroit, so to some extent, the location of Andrew Carnegie's childhood was not a small factor.
Okay, so we've got these cultures or clans, as you say, Mike, that are kind of disparate or separate from each other, isolated in some ways. They don't necessarily travel across bridges, which is still a thing today. And so there's this concern about, are you in the clan or not? And so in ministry, as you've been involved in ministry, ministering to people in different areas, because you're a Christ Church, which is a different kind of clan than when you were up in Cranberry, right?
Yep, Absolutely. And there's definitely an impact between this. It affects how you lead depending on what kind of clan that you're a part of, right? There's been a suspicion. I think this labor kind of versus management suspicion that was we talked about earlier, that still exists to this day. A lot of places, my wife works in Beaver County area. The mills left, and when they left, the labor or the generations now that are left behind have still suspicion of anyone who's coming in, because you might leave. You might take the resources that exist here and leave and go somewhere else. And so that still exists. Even as a pastor, you lead with a certain way of becoming part of the clan, be part of one of them. The Pittsburgh Steelers have a motto to the athletes. They say, no big shots. When an athlete becomes too me focused with the Pittsburgh Steelers, it rubs the culture the wrong way. They like their professional athletes to be part of the community, to be at the coffee shop, to talk to people, be part of the community. So there's definitely some sensitivity there. It takes when you're leading in this culture, whether that's in the marketplace, but even in the church as well. That kind of leadership is really, really important to be one of the people. So, in addition to that kind of division, there's this tension still that exists between labor and management. And leading here takes a lot of tact.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Can I jump in with Mike for just a second? An observation,
Sure.
Mike Arnold. You mentioned the steel culture in Beaver County, and I was asked to preach in a Presbyterian church there, and I was happy to do that. And the pastor was I said, tell me about your congregation and what the people. He says I'm not from here. He says, but I've observed that like in my church, I'm the boss. And they're the workers. It's like that they do what I say because I'm the boss. But there's also a little undercurrent of I don't know, a little bit of resentment, and it has nothing to do with me. It's just like that's kind of the way they look at the position and their role in the culture within the church, which I had never considered, never thought of that, never ran into that before. But I could understand how that could happen in a little steel mill community on the Ohio River. Sure.
It still is in every community, Bob. And the way that you build trust is you show up for mom when she's in the hospital. Like you go and you show up there, and then that gets around. They're like, oh, not only does he preach on Sunday, he actually was there in our time of need. And then that builds a bridge of like, he's with us, and that builds trust in this culture more than incredible ability. More than like in other cities, maybe if you're just the best preacher or you're super articulate, that builds respect. Here, you've got to build trust through doing the loyal things, the things that build that, and that actually builds a lot of trust here as well.
My wife is native to Western PA, and I'm a Silicon Valley transplant, moved to Pittsburgh, and I adapted to the Pittsburgh lifestyle. But my wife, she grew up here, and she's a pediatric surgeon at Children's Hospital, and part of that medical culture, which is obviously something there. But my wife is one of 6 kids. Her dad is one of 7, one of 11, and her mom is one of 7. So it brings us family situation that stayed in Western PA, and believe it or not, my wife's dad built a trade industry associated with welding and steel, and it was very successful started in the 60s, but as steel changed, he merged into this new industry, and his whole family was involved in the welding industry. And Miller Welding and Machining is, Brookville, Pennsylvania. He's the major industry in Brookville, which is kind of a satellite situation. So, but yeah, it was a family company that really worked together, and you could be trusted, and and people that did quality trades were immediately successful.
Interesting.
And that's what we saw in the welding industry.
So it seems like it's interesting as I'm thinking about this. Pittsburgh. I say this in the introduction. We're one of the 50 largest metro areas, or something like that. But we're the only one with a central county that kind of defines the city, if you will, Allegheny County, that had a declining population from 2010 to 2020, which is just really interesting. It sounds, though, as you were describing, Mike, that we're kind of our own worst enemy in terms of growing here, because what you described as someone wanting to move here or come here and start a business from outside, it's not like Austin, Texas, or Nashville, where it's like, hey, come on in. You have to come here, and it's not going to be easy. You're going to have to break in. You're in a sense, break in. That sounds terrible, but you're going to have to work hard to earn the trust to become part of the clan. But I imagine that many people maybe who've attempted that have kind of run up against that wall, that cultural difference there, that clannish, repelling, if you will, of outsiders. I mean, do you think that's probably contributed to the lack of growth here? Jeff Doherty with Allstate Insurance has the distinction of being the very first sponsor of the Redemptive Economics podcast, and I couldn't be happier to promote his services. I've known Jeff for many years now, both as his pastor and friend. And man, I can say with confidence that he is a man of strong faith who aligns well with the Redemptive Economics values. So reach out to Jeff. He can offer you options for a wide variety of coverage and services. He's committed to helping Pittsburgh residents assess their immediate and long-term needs and choose options that will help you achieve your goals. When you want to explore options for protecting your home, personal property, or financial future, Jeff Doherty is your guy. You'll find Jeff's contact information in the show notes. Hey, go grab a cup of coffee with him, get to know him, even if it's just to review your current coverage in case you need to make adjustments. And I promise you're going to love Jeff every bit as much as I do.
That's a great question. There's probably many reasons for that, but there is definitely a challenge if someone moves here to break in. Now, I have the benefit of being a pastor, so there's a community that invites me in, and you're immediately connected. But if you were working in a job, like I've talked with immigrants most recently that have moved here from India, there's a budding, it's a growing population of Indians that are moving to this area, medical and tech, and they are struggling to break in. They've shared that with me, that they're struggling to break into the culture. I mean, think about it this way. If you're from here, Sunday afternoon in the fall, you have something to do. If you're not going down to watch the game in person, you're at one of your relatives' house eating food. It is a cultural thing. It's Sunday afternoon. We eat after church and watch the Steelers. I mean, just if you want to go shopping during that time. There's no one out. There's no one out in the community during that time. But you imagine how lonely that would be if you didn't have a place to go, or you didn't understand that cultural phenomenon that happens in Western Pennsylvania. So there's definitely a challenge there. But there's, on the other side of that, Mike, man, when you break through, there's a fierce loyalty.
Great point. Yes.
There is a fierce loyalty that when you get grafted in, and Bob is teasing me because we talk about the Browns and Steelers all the time, but there's a fierce loyalty. Bob and I are friends, and I know that if I called him in the middle of the night, he would pick up the phone and he would come and see me. Once you're through that, it's real. It becomes it's not just lip service. There's a realness to that, but it takes some effort to get there, for sure.
It's really good as I think about so kind of the last thing I'd love to get a couple minutes of all of your input on is, for entrepreneurs who are still coming, who may want to come and take advantage of, I think a culture and a city and a region that could be ripe for entrepreneurial endeavors and development. And I think this is what we've discussed is incredibly helpful as a way to think about how to approach the culture here. But real quick, one question, I had a burning question, Steve, for you as we get into this real quick. I'm just really curious from your perspective, as you look at the geology of Pittsburgh, would coal and steel still be a viable industry here based on the geology?
Yes. There's plenty of coal in the basin, and it could still survive here. But there's other places in the world where it can happen. The Marcellus shales right here in in the county, and fracking technology is there, and we have 50 or 100 year supply of just natural gas right here in Pittsburgh. So things can happen.
Yeah.
And why not?
I was just curious. That I just thought, like, I realized the economics might not make sense, but just purely from a geological standpoint, what I'm hearing you say is obviously it's rich in natural gas, but all the elements are still here, and enough of it that producing steel and coal could still be interesting. I was just curious. So okay. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
The economics of steel has gone to China. I remember in the 70s at Penn State University, we hosted field trips. Geology happens around field trips. And we fellowship together as a community, that type of thing. But I remember we were hosting all kinds of Chinese geologists in the 70s, and we were giving them the technology that they needed to build their own steel industry.
Wow.
And oil and gas industry. So it part of the cooperation of being responsible, and but we're helping other countries, and we have.
That's fantastic. Interesting. Well, that's awesome. Thank you, Steve, for that perspective. So then part of my whole vision of this podcast from Redemptive Economics is having a redemptive impact through economic endeavors, entrepreneurial, and so as we think about, I personally believe that it's not going to be some big conglomerate coming in like Amazon, like we were hopeful for. I personally believe, in what I hope this podcast will help to promote, is a rising up of a multitude of Christian entrepreneurs to create, produce value for others, solve problems on a local level. And so what you guys have shared already today, I think is super helpful in perspective and how to approach that. But I guess I want to ask you guys if you have any last kind of thoughts or perspective you might want to offer to that person who might be in those shoes, who's listening and they're an entrepreneur, or they're beginning that process. Maybe it's still in idea form. What would you say to them as they approach the culture here in this region?
Go for it. We need you.
Yeah.
And our civic leaders understand that. And I think that they would be accommodating to create whatever they can do in terms of infrastructure to create whatever you need to carry out your dream.
Very good. Okay.
A couple of weeks ago, I was in Muncie, Indiana, and I was working with a church out there. And this young developer, entrepreneur, chose Muncie, Indiana. And he walked me around some of his projects. And one of his projects was he bought the county jail for $1,000. And there's a story around the jail there. It went $3 million over budget when they built it. They wanted to knock it down, and he's turning it into luxury apartments that are leasing for $3,000 a month in Muncie, Indiana. And he walked me through this project, and I looked at these amazing spaces and just thought of the irony of, like, people wanted to get out of that building forever, and now people are paying thousands of dollars to live in that building, right? And, and he went on to, I'm like, why? And he said he wasn't from Muncie. He's like, I chose to be here because of the opportunity is here. And he goes, look at what we can bring, how we can bring value to this space. And I kept thinking, we need that and more of that in Pittsburgh. And he was like, there are beautiful buildings here that we could take and redevelop, and we can make. We need that that creativity in whatever discipline or whatever market you're in. If those minds come to Pittsburgh, there's opportunity, and you can make great things here.
Station Square, classic example, was the downtown. It was the great railroad hub. My mother remembers that's where all the GIs would go when they got their draft notice, and they would go to wherever their base was for training, and it became a really interesting new configuration, a new entity. And I was visiting my daughter in Charlotte, and there's a place that used to be a textile center. It is no longer, but they have these textile mills, and somebody bought it, and now you go there, and there are all these different restaurants. It's basically a restaurant mall. And if you're going with three buddies, and you like Mexican and I like Italian and whatever, you just go. This is our table. You go to your restaurant order, and it will eat at this table together. And we love that place. Somebody was smart, figured out how to use what's already there and reinvent it. And we need that in Pittsburgh, and it can work.
Yeah.
Who would ever have thought that a drained ice age lake would make such an amazing thing?
That's right. Yeah.
Hey, man, Steve, that's so good, man. That's so good. Oh, I love it. I love it. It's just amazing how God has kind of worked in all sorts of different ways. And now we're in a place where we've got to, Pittsburgh has been in the process of reinventing itself. But again, I hope I don't offend anybody by saying this, but I don't think it's going to be the UPMCs who are going to, you know what I mean? Who are those big conglomerates who are going to come in that are in some ways in cahoots with the government and all this other stuff. It's going to be those people who decide to take up the mantle, especially Christians, the mantle of entrepreneurship, to risk and have skin in the game, and endeavor in these entrepreneurial experiments as we learn and figure out what works and what doesn't. And in the process, Mike, to your point, and Bob, you said this too, is that the to spend time like really entrenching ourselves in the culture, in the clans here, understanding that that's the reality, and don't kick against the goads as it says in Scripture, but instead, work with that and lead in such a way that earns the trust and builds love. I mean, that's such a Christ-like. What you guys are describing here is it's just right for that Christ-like approach in leadership. The incarnational approach as a business leader to really know and love the community and serve the community, So, man, I'm so grateful to you guys. Thank you, all of you. Bob, thank you so much. Mike, Steve, it has been, man, great perspective. Thank you for taking the time to share with us today. And I'm looking forward to having you guys back on at some point in the future.
Great to be with you guys.
Great to be with you guys too. Have a great day.